The start of the Mexican Independence War can be attributed to one man, Miguel Hidalgo. In the town of Dolores, Hidalgo was a priest and part of a revolutionary conspiracy, which was found out by the government and would soon be crushed if nothing was done soon. Hidalgo massed the people of his church, and, after an anti-colonial speech, the mob had been riled up and began marching towards Mexico City. As the people marched through cities, they gained more and more followers and defeated local militias, but the mob began pillaging cities they passed through for resources to fuel the revolution and for personal gain. Once Hidalgo and his men reached the town of Guanajuato, the locals, fearing what had happened to other towns like theirs, fled to the safety of a fortified granary. But, after a 2-day siege, the revolutionaries broke in and killed everyone inside. By this time, the movement had amassed over 10,000 people, and the number exponentially grew to over 100,000 as they came closer to Mexico City. But at the outskirts of the city, the revolutionaries suffered heavy losses, and many deserted the movement, seeing the military competence of the trained forces of New Spain versus the unorganized mob that they were a part of. Soon the mob suffered defeat after defeat, in spite of vastly superior numbers, which eventually led to Hidalgo's capture and execution by the new Spanish government. Although ending in a defeat, this movement sparked insurgencies across the nation. A leading insurgence was one led by José María Morelos, which had a disciplined and trained army that proved to be a thorn in the side of the royalists. Morelos signed an official declaration of independence of Mexico, but soon after, his army was isolated and picked off by royalists, with the eventual capture of Morelos himself. The other movements of New Spain attacked royalists with guerrilla tactics, and harassed the government constantly, but were never able to make serious gains, which led to long drawn-out fighting throughout the colony. Luckily for the revolutionaries, the government rarely sent supplies, reinforcements, or even payment to their colonial armies, leading to higher taxation and pillaging. But the liberal government of New Spain limited taxation, so many soldiers who were coerced into military service for money deserted. But soon, the royalist army led a string of victories against the rebels that sent them on their hind legs. But one, Colonel Iturbide, learned of a liberal democracy which had overthrown the monarchy in Spain. He, a stark conservative, met with the people he was sent to destroy in an effort to maintain his monarchist values in the colony. After this meeting, the two opposing armies combined under one document called the Three Guarantees. This document listed the values of the soon-to-be independent Mexico, and the agreed-upon terms were as follows. 1. There would be a monarchy in Mexico, but a constitutional monarchy, to please both the royalists and revolutionaries, who wanted government representation. 2. The aristocracy would maintain power, but all people were equal, which pleased the aristocracy obviously, and the revolutionaries, who were often people of color unjustly treated. 3. Catholicism would remain the religion of the state. As word spread of this document, many former royalist soldiers defected and joined this new cause, and the Three Guarantees were nearly universally accepted by the people of New Spain. Seeing the overwhelming odds against him, the Viceroy of New Spain signed the Declaration of Independence and fled the newly independent Mexican Empire. But some loyal soldiers held out in the port of Veracruz for many years. Now, as no European rulers wanted to take the Mexican throne, with the Spanish king regaining control in Mexico, Iturbide was crowned Emperor of Mexico. Although hesitant at first, the power soon went to his head, as Iturbide dissolved Congress and repressed freedom of speech. This secured Iturbide many enemies, who were promised a constitutional monarchy. Now, a rebel army formed, and as Iturbide sent his own army, many of his own soldiers defected, which forced the emperor to realize his perilous situation, and he chose abdication over assassination. Iturbide was promptly exiled, and in his wake the United Mexican States was born, a federal republic that allowed for its states to have some internal self-governance. The Spanish, still bitter that they lost their colony, used the fortress of Ulua, that the Spanish never lost control of, as a base to harass the Mexicans and even bombard Veracruz. As Mexico had no navy, this was an issue, so the Republic began the construction of some warships, which, once built, blockaded the fort. There was a short fight, but eventually the Spanish were defeated and ousted from the stronghold. This did not deter the Spanish, as, from Cuba, they landed several thousand soldiers on Mexican soil. But this army was swiftly defeated, leading to the eventual recognition of Mexican independence. Then, a coup d'etat was organized to oust the string of conservative leaders elected into government. But this caused the provinces of Tejas and Yucatan to declare independence from Mexico. The Tejans refused any talks with the Mexican government, as they felt they had an independent identity from Mexico, as many English-speaking settlers had recently made their homes there. Due to a majority of these settlers being American-born, most of them advocated for slavery, which was abolished in Mexico. The people also anglicized their name, now calling it Texas. The Mexicans lost the Texan Independence War, which forced the Mexicans to leave them alone, although never recognizing Texan independence. At the same time, the province of New Mexico struggled with constant Native American raids and American encroachment in the region, as the American government had been eyeing up the region for some time. Now, looters attacked a bakery owned by a Frenchman near Mexico City, and the shop owner sent a letter to the King of France stating that he demanded thousands of pesos for compensation from the Mexican government and never received it. The French sent a fleet to disturb the Mexicans, and they managed to blockade all ports, land, and overtake Veracruz, which was the primary Mexican trading port, and that housed all Mexican military vessels. This caused the Mexicans to smuggle their products through a Texan port. But the Texans feared the French blockading their ports, so they began patrolling Texan waters in search of Mexican smugglers. This all was resolved when the Mexicans were strong-armed into paying 600,000 pesos to the French in reparations. After the American annexation of Texas, the Americans marched their troops past the Nueces River, which was the agreed-upon border, to the Rio Grande River. At the same time, an American ambassador was in Mexico City, offering to buy California and New Mexico. This, alongside several other incursions into Mexican lands, enraged Mexico, and they attacked the American troops stationed past the Nueces River, which began the Mexican-American War. Due to this attack being unexpected, the Mexicans saw a few victories against American troops, which led to the beginning of the siege of Fort Texas. Yet, as reinforcements arrived to aid the besieged Americans, flaws began to show in the Mexican army. The men were armed with Napoleonic-era rifles and cannons, and without a sense of nationalism or national unity, many soldiers barely had a reason to fight. The Mexicans sent out a raiding party to disturb the advance of American reinforcements, but this was swiftly defeated, which led to a rout of the Mexican army. The Mexican army stationed in New Mexico feared the American army, and so constantly fled conflict, leading to the annexation of the province without a man killed in combat. At the same time, out of fear of being expelled from their homes, or being killed, many American-born settlers overtook the local government of California, and soon, an American army marched into the territory to claim it for the nation. The Mexican army in Texas continued to retreat further into Mexican territory, with all of their heavy artillery being lost in flight. But the army decided to make its stand at the town of Monterrey. The ensuing battle was brutal and long, with the Mexican army not giving up, forcing the Americans to fight for every corner and every building in the city. Yet, in the end, the Mexican army was forced to sign a 2-month armistice, which allowed for them to flee once again. All the while, many cities on the Pacific coast were being navally invaded by the Americans. This prompted the Mexican armies to attempt to retake their conquered cities, only resulting in defeat after defeat. The Mexican government had massive issues recruiting soldiers, and keeping those they had from deserting. So, even though they knew about a planned attack on Veracruz, the defending army was tiny. The city soon fell, giving the Americans a foothold in the heartland of Mexico, with a direct path to Mexico City, which they attacked fairly easily, and a peace treaty came soon after. This treaty forcing the Mexican state to hand over around 1/3 of its territory, including the disputed land claimed by Texas. Soon the Americans offered to buy more land off the Mexicans, who reluctantly agreed, due to the fact they needed more money to rebuild their nation after the disastrous war that had just ravaged the nation. Ever since its independence, Yucatan had been in a devastating civil war between the Mayan and European people. In exchange for military aid, the Yucatan state renounced its sovereignty and rejoined Mexico. Soon, liberal ideas spread throughout the lower classes, who saw the flaws of the Mexican state that had slowly become more authoritarian, and, by the performance in the Mexican-American War, the need for modernization. There was a rebellion led by many hopeful young men, and as the movement began to show signs of victory, Santa Anna, the Mexican dictator, abdicated and fled the country. Now in control, the liberal government began many reforms, such as the separation of church and state, as well as the banning of corporation-owned property. This wasn't universally supported, and another civil war broke out, with conservative rebels attempting to reinstate the previous government. But this was crushed. The new republic was put to the test once again as a coalition of Spain, France, and Britain declared war on Mexico on the basis of unpaid debts. But France, who organized the coalition, sought to expand its empire into the Americas. The coalition landed in Veracruz and conquered much of the coastline. But, once France's allies learned of its true intentions, they abandoned the war, leaving France alone to take on Mexico. This didn't stop the French army from making significant gains and advancing towards Mexico City. But, at Puebla, the French were stopped in their advance, shocking the attackers and many world powers who expected the Mexican state to fall easily. But once the French received reinforcements, they were able to seize the capital. Once established, the Second Mexican Empire was declared, with an Austrian ruler as a French puppet. The Mexican government had been begging the United States for aid due to their policy of restricting European expansion in the Americas. But, due to the American Civil War, the best Mexico received was purchasing arms. Yet, once the American Civil War concluded, they rushed to aid Mexico, and scared the French into leaving the nation alone. And now, the nation saw great economic growth and improvement to infrastructure, as many Western nations invested in Mexico. Now, a prime ministerial candidate, sour that he lost the Mexican election, overthrew the government and instated a dictatorship. This government was instituted under the guise of a democracy, but still, the economy grew and the military was reduced, but modernized. The common folk of Mexico became increasingly suppressed and limited as time went on, while a mostly foreign proletariat owned most land and were the only ones with access to education. The economic stability of Mexico came to an end when the United States stopped purchasing Mexican metals, which caused an economic crash that made the people lose faith in their dictator's rule. What ensued was a civil war fought between many factions who imposed and deposed various dictatorial leaders over many years, which allowed for Mexico to avoid sending men to fight in the First World War. Still, the Germans offered an alliance with Mexico if the United States joined the war, for Mexico to regain the lands lost during the Mexican-American War. This proposal was rejected as the US was seen as too powerful to antagonize. Once a stable democracy was established in Mexico, there were still anti-government fighters scattered throughout central Mexico in opposition to the newly imposed liberal constitution, but these people were quickly crushed. Yet, the new leadership began restricting the power of the church, which began another civil war. This ended with the clerical limitations remaining law, but not entirely enforced. The popularity of fascism began to rise in Mexico, and the government nationalized its oil, which scared many traditional purchasers of Mexican oil, like the UK, the US, and France, which forced the nation to sell its oil to Germany and Italy, tying it closer to the Axis. But, as the Second World War became increasingly brutal, and the need for Mexican resources increased, Mexico leaned towards aiding the Allies, and eventually declaring war on Germany after some tankers were sunk by German U-boats. Mexico did send some troops, but their crown jewels were the Aztec Eagles, a group of fighter pilots who fought against Japan in the Pacific. Now, due to the high demand for Mexican resources, the nation entered a period of drastic economic growth and industrialization that continued after the war, which was helped by a new political stability. Now, due to the government's violent suppression of a gang fight, many protests were sparked in Mexico City. And due to this happening just before the Olympic Games being held in Mexico, the military was ordered to open fire on a group of protesters. The crowd was dispersed, leaving around 400 civilians dead. This was followed by a series of economic crises, largely blamed on the nationalization of banks. The value of the peso consistently fell until it steeply dropped, which caused mass protests, and the rise of the anarcho-socialist Zapatista movement that came to control land in Mexico. Eventually, the economy recovered and began to rise again, but the drug cartel had taken hold of Mexico. But due to the easy access of American weaponry, the attempt by the Mexican government at suppression quickly turned violent. This war on drugs was pressured by the United States, as the primary source of illegal substances in the United States are trafficked over the US-Mexican border. These pressures were increased when Donald Trump threatened severe tariffs and even closing the border. And that is the state of the nation of Mexico.